For our last session of the day, we have a session devoted to wind instruments, which is a favorite topic of mine, of course. And this session includes 3 papers, and they deal with a variety of media and sources. So I think I'm going to find that very interesting, and I hope you will too. Our first presenter is Patrick Connor Dittamo, who's going to talk to us about the Dolzflöte.
Of the various types of flutes used in Europe during the early modern period, transverse-blown duct flutes have generally been relegated to the margins in scholarship. This is quite understandable, as there are no surviving instruments and only limited testimony in the historical record to their existence and usage. That many are aware of them at all is due almost entirely to the inclusion of 2 Dolzflöten in Plate 9 of Michael Praetorius' Theatrum Instrumentorum of 1620. Today, taking after Praetorius, I will tentatively refer to early modern European transverse duct flutes collectively as Dolzflöten, though as I will demonstrate, historically their nomenclature was far from stable. Dolzflöten as a type are categorized by a 6-hole fingering system and a head with a faux flute-style embouchure hole which channels air into a chamber adjoined by a recorder-like block, windway, and labium. Depending upon the placement of that labium, Dolzflöten can appear to the unwary eye to be little more than standard transverse flutes. This paper threads together a patchwork of early modern European references to and depictions of the Dolzflöte and later 19th century encyclopedic works. The instrument emerged sometime before the late 16th century, seems to have gently paralleled changes in wind instrument design in the 17th and 18th centuries, and fell out of use by the early 19th century, if not earlier. It also came to share its name with an organ stop, a point which will not be addressed in any great detail today. Following the trail, the Dolzflöte serves to illustrate the marvelous diversity of nomenclature in early modern Europe. Judging by the earliest references to transverse duct flutes, the Dolzflöte may have originated in southern Germany, somewhere in modern-day Bavaria or Baden-Württemberg, or perhaps even in Switzerland. Our earliest potential reference before Praetorius is found in a 1577 inventory of the property of one Jacobi Alendi Augustani, a merchant from Augsburg, then resident in Krakow, Poland, which refers to 2 chests of Schweizerflöten. Based on other instruments present in the inventory, we can distinguish these Schweizerflöten from recorders, Flöten, and fifes, Schweizerpfeifen. Contemporary German language inventories, such as those of the courts of Graz and Stuttgart, use the term zwerchflöte for transverse flutes, reserving Flöten for duct flutes like recorders and tabor pipes. Thus, following the reasoning of David Lassky, the Schweizerflöten here may be taken to mean Flöten, recorders, that were Swiss in some manner, perhaps in their origin, but more likely due to the manner in which they were played, that is, transversely, like the flutes and fifes famously played by Swiss and German mercenaries in the late 15th and 16th centuries. A 1589 inventory of instruments at the Baden-Württemberg court at Stuttgart is much simpler to interpret. Included along with a great number of recorders, here called Flaten, but in a separate section from the list of flutes, Zwerchpfeifen, we find a consort of tenor and bass Zwerchflöten, which the inventory writer helpfully informed us are used like flutes. Dolzflöten are also to be found in 2 inventories of the Hofkapelle of the Landgraf of Hesse in Kassel in 1613 and 1638. They were not present in an older and much smaller inventory taken 40 years earlier in 1573. In 1613, we find a case of Zwerchflöten consisting of a bass and 5 others, a larger consort by 1 instrument than that in Stuttgart, possibly including a treble. The 1638 inventory, which is riddled with references to missing instruments, presents us with challenges. It includes a case containing 3 Dolzflöten and 3 Zwerchflöten, likely the same case from 1613. And this is the first time that a transverse duct flute is associated with a modifier drawn from the Latin dulcis, sweet. However, there are unexpectedly additional Zwerchflöten listed in the inventory. Some may have been other Dolzflöten, but others seem to clearly correspond to sets of transverse flutes from the 1613 inventory's descriptions, likely indicating either an ignorant inventory maker or else the emergence of terminological slippage between zwerchflöten and zwerchpfeifen in the intervening 25 years, in this case favoring the standard transverse flute. The earliest depiction as a Dolzflöte, as mentioned, is in the previously mentioned Theatrum Instrumentorum of 1620, a pictorial supplement illustrating the instruments described in Praetorius' De Organographia, the second volume of his monumental treatise Syntagma Musicum. Standard transverse flutes are called querpfeifen and sometimes querflöten in the German of Praetorius' Syntagma Musicum, the prefix quer having replaced the regional variant zwerch. Pfeifs here are Schweizerpfeifen, and recorders are intermittently flöten, blockflöten, or plockflöten, exchanging the initial plosive consonants. In De Organographia, Praetorius provides only a sentence of description of Dolzflöten, telling us that, like flutes, the same capability, that is, a range of 19 tones, is had by the Dolzflöten, which are otherwise called querflöten, like the flutes, except that they are intoned and blown like plockflöten. For all its brevity, this passage has caused some confusion for modern scholars. Harold Buenfeld's somewhat unreliable translation of De Organographia takes an inferential leap from Praetorius' verb intonieret and translates the sentence to say that the Dolzflöte had, quote, 8 holes like the recorder, while in his later translation, David Z. Crooks, overlooking the mouth holes shown in Theatrum Instrumentorum, decided that it was common sense that the Dolzflöte was an end-blown 6-hole recorder like a tin whistle. We know from earlier inventories that the Dolzflöte was made in at least 2 sizes, tenor and bass. Praetorius' Tabella Universalis of instrument ranges and tunings in De Organographia provides the ranges of transverse flutes and Dolzflöten, querflöten, together in a single staff segment, while separating out the range of fifes, suggesting that the Dolzflöte could have been built in as many as 3 sizes, bassus, adjoint tenor altus, and cantus, pitched in descending fifths at G, D, and A, respectively. However, in Plate 9 of Theatrum Instrumentorum, Praetorius has only shown 2 sizes of Dolzflöten, pitched in G and D. While Praetorius' woodcuts have long been praised for their drafting, detail, and verisimilitude, scrutiny over the years has identified occasional mistakes, lapses, and oversights, and even contradictions between the plates and his text. In the case of the Dolzflöte, the finger holes for the tenor in D have been entirely omitted from the woodcut, and the pitch indication G alongside the bass has been misplaced next to the 4th finger hole instead of the 6th. A similar mistake was made with the bass flute, which is upside down in the woodcut compared to the other transverse flutes, resulting in its G annotation being placed next to its 1st hole instead of the 6th. However, Praetorius' general attention to scaling potentially presents us with an opportunity to learn more about Dolzflöten. Herbert Myers and Boaz Burney have both calculated that the recorder consort depicted in this plate was pitched in Praetorius' Kammerton, around A at 464 Hz, or A+1 in Bruce Haynes' classification system, while the flute consort depicted was pitched a major third lower, around A 373 Hz, or A-3, a whole tone lower than Praetorius' Chorton, which is A-1. Low-pitched consorts were said by Praetorius to be desirable for certain instruments, since they, quote, sound more grave and splendid the lower they are pitched, end quote, resulting in a different and less harsh sound. On sounding length alone, it is clear that the Dolzflöten shown by Praetorius were pitched differently than the flutes. Irksomely, the bass and tenor are not in proper 3-to-2 proportion to one another given their nominal pitches, indicating that either their real-life models were from consorts at different pitch levels, or else the block cutter, or the provider of the block cutter's exemplar, erred. Assuming a more or less a cylindrical bore profile like that of contemporary flutes, or even a more complex bore like recorders, the tenor Dolzflöte would have sounded roughly at modern pitch in D, whereas the bass would have been pitched a semitone lower in Praetorius' Chorton A-1. And now this plate also presents other difficulties to us. Given that the Dolzflöten share the nominal ranges of their flute cousins, how did they overblow? No thumbhole is mentioned in the text, nor is one illustrated, but as I noted, the block cutter failed to include any finger holes on the tenor Dolzflöte, the only one which is provided with both front and rear views. While it is within the realm of possibility that the Dolzflöte was voiced in such a manner as to readily overblow, I suspect that at least a thumbhole or possibly a more complex, even a more complex bore profile may have been employed to split the difference in design, sound, and response between flutes on the one hand and recorders on the other. But that is speculation, and the historical record is silent on this subject. The first reference outside of German-speaking lands to a possible Dolzflöte comes from Nottinghamshire, where a 1636 inventory of the musical instruments of William Cavendish, Duke of Newcastle, itemizes a flute and a, quote, flute recorder amongst the instruments inherited by the Duke from his maternal aunt, Lady Jane Ogle, the wife of Edward Talbot, the 8th Earl of Shrewsbury, via the Duke's mother, Lady Catherine Cavendish, her sister. The inventory includes a note indicating their origin from Lady Jane's estate, saying, "This flute and flute recorder were taken out of the chest that came from Rufford." The unusual repeated phrasing in this inventory, flute recorder, raises the possibility that the instrument was, like continental zwerchflöten and Dolzflöten, a transverse duct flute. The Dolzflöte next appears in the historical record in the art of the Low Countries in the mid-17th century. Thanks to Nicholas Lander, aficionados of the recorder may be aware of this black and white photograph held by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Dating from the mid-20th century, the photograph reproduces a Dutch painting which clearly depicts an instrument with both an embouchure hole and a labium. Though the body of this instrument is obscured by its owner's hand and the lutenist's arm, it appears to largely retain the cylindrical exterior profile of its counterparts in Theatrum Instrumentorum, but boasts a simple ornamental turning between the mouth hole and labium. I am pleased to say that with the aid of art historians at the University of Chicago, I have been able to identify the current location of the original painting shown in this photograph, which was donated to the Musée de Picardie in Amiens in 1926. Formerly attributed to the Dutch painter Joos van Crespiek, it is now believed to have been painted by a different anonymous student of Adriaan Brewer, whose painting on the same subject was auctioned in Lucerne in 1933, and presumably remains in private hands if it survived the Second World War. Finally, by sheer dumb luck, I chanced upon the eldest painting in this family, painted by Brewer's teacher, Johannes Hals, which was put up for auction in 2013 and again in 2017, and remains in private hands. As you can see, all three paintings show a clear rendering of a Dolzflöte's head with a mouth hole and labium. In the 18th century, new innovations in wind instrument design were applied to the Dolzflöte, as were new naming conventions. To begin with, in Johann Gottfried Walther's 1732 Musikalisches Lexikon oder Musikalische Bibliothek, the first major German language music dictionary ever compiled, under the entry for flauto traverso, Walther describes both fifes and the still somewhat recent Baroque form of the transverse flute with a single key set against a spring. He goes on to say that the flute allemande has a block in the cavity where the embouchure is. However, the flute traversière has no block, indicating that at least a German form of the one-key traverso at this time was a Dolzflöte, while the generic French form was not. Comprehensive reference works such as Walther's and others I'm discussing were subject to cannibalization by other compilers in the 18th and 19th centuries, and Walther's definition was repeated by later authors. The ambitious Encyclopédie, edited by Denis Diderot and Jean de Lemond d'Alembert, gives us our most detailed view of the 18th century incarnation of the Dolzflöte. In the Lutherie supplement, the Encyclopédie's engravers depict not only a double-keyed Dolzflöte, here called a traversière à bec, but also a narrow-bored form of the instrument as a simple fife. While the entry on the traversière à bec claims that its fingering is like that of a recorder, it is clear that the key on the second joint does function like a thumb hole, and it is clear that it functions like a thumb hole. The key on the foot joint, on the other hand, is analogous to the D-sharp key of a Baroque traverso. The article's author also takes time to describe the difference in playing technique between the traversière à bec and the flute traversière, noting the direct application of the lips. Our sole known inventory record from the 18th century of possible Dolzflöte comes from the estate auction of the city magistrate Michael von Bolhuy of Groningen in 1764. Item number 28, following after a bass recorder, flute, and an Oberländer traverso, was another instrument by Oberländer with a mouthpiece as on a recorder. While this could have been a recorder with ornamental turnings like that of a traverso, it seems more likely that such an instrument would simply be listed as a recorder, whereas an 18th century Dolzflöte would have been regarded as a traverso of some kind. In the 19th century, whatever the name du jour, the Dolzflöte was labeled as obsolete, beginning with Koch's Musikalisches Lexikon of 1802. We learn his entry refers us to the entry for that of the Dolzflöte, where we learn that not only is it obsolete, but at times the modern flute is also referred to by some by the name of the Deutsche Subsequent compilers followed Koch's lead. However, Gustav Schilling in 1835 took a different tack. Describing both the instrument and the organ style of the same name, he copies Koch's entry but adds an interpolation that in more recent times, the so-called modern flute currently in use is sometimes called the Deutsche Flöte or Dolzflöte. With what right? It may remain unexamined for the moment. The article Flöte includes more details. However, he does not deliver on this promise, and his article on the Flöte, while it speaks of many things in its lengthy stretch, does not discuss the Dolzflöte. While encyclopedias over the next 50 years will continue to provide Deutschflöte as an alternative name, notwithstanding Schilling's terse protest, the term did eventually come to be regularly applied to the transverse flute as well, until Hugo Riemann's influential Musiklexikon stripped any reference to Deutschflöte from his short definition for the Dolzflöte, winding up the terminological afterlife of the Dolzflöte. A question that has no doubt occurred to you, and I apologize, I'm over time, is why? Why was an instrument like the Dolzflöte invented, and why did it persist in the liminal spaces on the edges of music making in early modern Europe? In the late 16th century, when the recorder was the flute du jour, the Dolzflöte may have begun as a way to allow mixed groups of flautists and those without flute embouchures to play in consort with matched timbres and appearances. Given the potential advantages a thumbhole and variations in bore profile could offer, it might also have been an attempt to solve the intractable tuning problems inherent in the cylindrical flutes of the day while maintaining something of their look and character. Or, given the preference for bass and tenor instruments amongst inventoried Dolzflöten, it might have begun as an attempt to avoid the awkward ergonomics of the bass flute that sometimes led players to take unorthodox postures with their instruments, as described by Pierre Trichet in his Traité instruments de musique, circa 1640. In the later 16th and 17th centuries, as many treble wind instruments left consort settings to become soloists, and the transverse flute was in the ascendant, the Dolzflöte could have served as a means to an end for aspiring but impatient flautists, especially amongst elite amateurs. As a postscript, it also bears noting that there may not be a single evolutionary thread to the history of what I've cautiously termed the Dolzflöte family. After all, the idea has no doubt occurred to anyone who struggled to form a flute embouchure. Regardless, as an instrument, the Dolzflöte and its permutations serves as a reminder of the complex and messy diversity of early modern wind instruments, and as a carrier of many names, some of them, like flute allemande, strongly associated with the standard transverse flute, the Dolzflöte adds yet another wrinkle to the complicated and overlapping terminological history of the transverse flute and the recorder. Finally, the curious and elusive Dolzflöte might make us suspect that if we could only pull the head joints away from the mouths of frozen flautists in early modern artworks, every so often we might just find a hidden block and a labium. Thank you.
Are there any depictions of the instrument being played? I'm just curious to know what that looks like.
Yeah, so if, for the example, in the Dutch paintings, if the instrument were being played, the window would be hidden between us and the player.
Right.
And so there are no depictions of one in usage. Only we have these chance Dutch capturings of it and these reference works where it's in this sterile environment.
So do you think part of the point of that is to show you what it looks like, rather than? play?
Yeah, and plus it's constantly equivocated to the transverse flute in its range and quality. Although in the Walter, I believe, it mentions that the flute without a block can go 2 tones higher.
And I also would like to know, has anyone reproduced one, and have you tried to play one, and what does it sound like?
No one has reproduced these instruments to my knowledge. I have scoured, and part of it is it's an awkward niche because flautists are going to want to play a flute, and recordists are going to play recorders, or play on voice flutes to poach flute repertoire. So it's really this rarefied form that doesn't have a clear repertoire, therefore not a clear demand amongst modern performers.
It just seemed to me that if you did that, you might gain some insight into some of your questions.
Indeed. And really speculative reconstructions using a sheerly cylindrical profile or a hidden 16th century recorder profile could yield interesting information, as could the more Baroque form. I concur.
All right, thank you. Further questions?
Hi, thank you, Patrick. I know you said you weren't going to talk much about the connection with the organ stop, but I'm curious if you have any sense of whether there is an imitative quality to the organ stop. I mean, I think my general sense is that when you see dolce flute or some variety of that on an organ, it's usually just denotes kind of like a soft-voiced flute stop. Do you have a sense of these instruments, if there's any lineage there, or is it just kind of an appropriation of a name?
I honestly don't think that the organ stop is modeled after the instrument, unlike, say, a Gemshorn stop or a Kramhorn stop, because, for one thing, none of the definitions from the treatise, from the reference works that are explicitly about organ stops, or even later in Syntagma Musicum, where Praetorius discusses organ building and mentions that stop, he does not allude to the instrument in the discussion of the pipes and their construction and their character, nor do any of the definitions in encyclopedias or dictionaries that have have sub-entries, one for the instrument and one for the organ stop. So I think it's a case of sweet flute being such a generic term, the same sort of problems that plagued, Dulcena, Ducen, Dulcian in dealing with these sorts of questions. Certainly.
Well, I'm trying to remember from your notation chart from Praetorius. Does he say that these Dolzflöte are notated at 4-foot pitch?
No, I don't think he specifies. So the Tabellus Universalis doesn't contain any additional annotation. It just, in the caption, includes...
Well, can you go back to that
yes.
slide?
Yeah, okay. Not sure how fast this is going to progress backward. Sorry, the way I built my slides. I want to be able to see every shift, and so...
I think you've gone... Oh, there it is. No, that's not... Yeah,
there we go.
There's the pitch chart.
Yeah, so he has them at the flute pitches, and not nothing to indicate that they would play above like recorders, when he discusses recorder pitch, at least in the text. Something I didn't have space to include, and I realized actually I misgauged the timing, and so I started speeding at the end because I thought I was out of time, is that so far as transverse-blown duct flutes are concerned, the 19th century does have them, but they're no longer under these rubrics. We see transverse-blown duct flutes that are flagellets, and also flute heads made by Bainbridge in the 19th century. So alternative heads for other flutes, or heads for flutes that he himself, his company made, that have hidden ducts like this. And of course, by the 19th century, given the cachet of the transverse flute, it even more betokens players to want to look like they have that specialized embouchure. And we have examples of these instruments in the 19th century in the Dayton Miller collection at Library of Congress, as well as at least the Bate and Horniman museums that I'm aware of. And there may be others that I haven't quite trawled up in my searchings of catalogs. But I do think that they operate in a different cultural space, as we have the shift in instrumental production in the 19th century with industrialization and mass markets. But that's a wider view of the instrument type, which I don't think it just operates in a very different zone from these earlier instruments that I've been discussing today. Thank you very much.